Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first ever episode of TPOG, the podcast of gaming presented by TBOG. I am joined here today by my wonderful friends Cora,
Hello.
Max,
Salutations.
and Oecus.
Hey,
Today we're going to be discussing what got us into gaming. So we're going to be discussing the first few games we played, discussing why we got into gaming into the first place, the platforms we did, and the very beginning of our journey in for what has, in many of our cases, has been something that has been going on our entire life. And where did it all begin? And that's sort of today's discussion that we're going to be going over. We're expecting a little bit of tangential stuff going on a bit later, but we'll see how it all rolls out. Yeah, so we're going to kick things off today with the person who was by far the most eager to start a podcast with us. It is, of course, Oecus. So why don't you get us kicked off, Oecus? How did you get into gaming? What were your first few games? Regale us with your stories.
so personally, I think it's like a question that's multi-layered because if I just said what got me into gaming, it's that I got a console and then that would be it. But lots of people have gotten consoles, games, etc., but aren't really playing today or play as much as me. So I would say what initially got me into it was I can't remember the first memory of getting a console, but I remember getting the PS1, and that started it. I also remember on the PC having Lego games or, those educational games that let you solve problems while doing things, and that initially kicked off me loving gaming.
I think I
Um,
know the ones you mean. It was like Lego Mindstorm or something like that, right? That's like,
yes,
yeah. I'm
yes.
remembering that. No, that is a throwback because I remember those myself. Those classic Lego games with that Lego intro where it would all just come. The Lego logo would be made up of all the little bricks, and with that music, that's a throwback. That's nice and nostalgic.
Yeah, the Lego games, I think were some of the best older games that you could get on your PC, and those were a good time. But what pushed it even farther is that I was in a neighborhood full of kids my age, and I have a brother, so I was able to play multiplayer games and, compete against them or go over a friend's house and play a different console such as the GameCube, or we would get our DSs and play together. So I'll say what initially got me into gaming is the fact that, my parents gave me a console to start at home, and then I had friends and family members to play with.
Yeah. So what sort of you mentioned obviously a lot of like local multiplayer games there. So what sort of things were you playing? Like GoldenEye, was that a bit too early for you? Might be a bit of a boomer there.
So for me, it was mostly racing games. So my brother and I loved racing games, and one of the first racing games I remember getting was Need for Speed for the PC. And that one was Need for Speed 2, I think. But Need for Speed 2, I don't have too much memory of. It's Need for Speed High Stake, playing with my brother in that game that I remember. And the special thing about that game is that you could bet your car against the other person. And if you lost the race, you lost your car. So I remember having fun playing against my brother in that. And the other game is Tekken. So even though I suck at fighting games now, I just remember button mashing Tekken like crazy on the PlayStation 1.
Walking back to the racing game for a second, and to kind of tie into the Lego part, did you ever play Lego Racer on the PC? It came out like 1999.
I had a feeling that was coming.
Oh, did you? Did you play
Yeah,
that as well?
I played that. Yeah,
Yeah, I had a friend that lived across the street from me whose dad had it on PC, and you could like build your own car and stuff.
yeah. That's I actually recently I played it a couple of years back, and it is way more difficult than I remembered it being. It's like the yeah. Even just like the first like campaign race was really bloody difficult. But you just end up having to cheese it by doing like the boost power ups as much as you can. But yeah, no, that was a fun game. Good old Rocket Racer.
Surprisingly, no for me. The main Lego games that I had were like what Paris said, the Mindstorm, and then there's one called like Adventure Island or something like that, and then the other one was like Agents or something around that. But in terms of Lego Racers, no. Surprisingly, that wasn't one of the games I played.
Wait, you mean just Lego Island is the one you meant? I think.
I
The
can't.
Yeah,
one
I
with
was
the rock.
about to say, I was just about to look it up and see if like I'm just gonna post it in the TPOG chat and
Yeah,
like if that's the one, like if you recognize that,
that's the one I was thinking of.
Yes, that's the one.
That's yeah, that's a throwback. That was like I don't know. I remember thinking it was so amazing at the time, being able to like explore the whole island. Just like, oh, I could get in a helicopter. I could drive around in a race car. This is great. But you couldn't even like get off the roads. Like you couldn't move out onto the grass or anything like that. It was so restrictive. But for what it was a delightful little game.
So moral of the story is that Lego was the greatest game that got us all into gaming. No, but yeah, initially I would say these type of PC games are what got me started, and again, playing against, my friends and family were at least the start. And of course, like I said, it's layers to this, so I want to pass it on to other people before I, say like what rejuvenated my interest in it. So I'm passing it on.
But before you do that, I just want to ask. You mentioned that you played Tekken. Do you remember who you played most in that? Like you mentioned that you mashed a lot, so I'm assuming Eddie. But I mean, other than that, like if like were you an Eddie player? Like did you play someone else, or do you even remember?
I'm probably gonna butcher their name, so all I know it starts with an H because I have no clue how to pronounce his
Oh,
name.
you're probably thinking of either Heihachi or Hwoarang. Those are the only H characters in Tekken that I can think of.
He would
Yeah,
know
the second
Heihachi
one.
surely. Yeah, I was gonna say it's not.
Hwoarang. Okay, so it's Tekken 3.
We all have shared experience of him. There's no way he would have forgotten. It so it's interesting. It's like I could definitely obviously back then we're talking like the early 2000s, late 90s that we were all focused on the local multiplayer, and at the time I think gaming was sort of like beginning to sort of boom a bit, especially around like children, and it was becoming something that's slightly more socially acceptable and less of like a nerd hobby. So local multiplayer games, you think like Halo, for example, around that time, Mario Kart, all that sort of stuff were becoming more of a thing. So that's yeah, that doesn't surprise me actually. That's sort of like kind of what drew you in initially. Yeah. So yeah. Sorry, sorry, say something.
Yeah, so that is what drew me in.
Yeah. So you mentioned the racing games. Obviously, I think that's become something that's become a bit more sort of persistent with you going through the years. I think kind of it's something you mention quite often that you wish there were like more good ones of. So other than like Need for Speed, for example, were you sort of playing more like the sim sort of racing games, like stuff like Gran Turismo, for example, or was it more arcadey sort of stuff you found?
So besides Need for Speed, the main other racing game that had an impact on me was Gran Turismo, and I remember first seeing it because my uncle had it when I visited his house, and I loved cars at the time, so just seeing the cars in the game and seeing how realistic for its time the game was amazing to me. And then I remember I was gifted Gran Turismo, and that was probably the only game that I ever remember having two discs at the time. So that was an interesting game to me. Like I loved just the fact that it was two discs, even though it didn't mean much. Um, and other racing games that had an impact were Burnout, because my brother and I would compete against each other trying to get the highest score. And of course, the game that everybody played together, Mario Kart, which we were lucky at the time. I'm pretty sure you guys remember how for DS, Mario Kart allowed only one person to have the game. and then anybody else who had a DS could join, even if they didn't have the game. So playing that with friends was anywhere you went, you could play with someone.
Yeah, I remember playing that a lot on the bus on the way home from school because there was like 7 or 8 kids on my route that had the game. And so we would have full lobbies for at least the first 15, 20 minutes of the ride home.
Oh, that's pretty cool. That is pretty cool. I feel like I'm going crazy here. When the hell did the DS come out? Like, in my mind,
2004, I think.
so that's roughly what I had in mind. Maybe I'm just thinking of the wrong time frame in terms of when Quick would be doing this. But I don't know. I don't know. I had like 2001, 2002 in mind for some reason. But like, yeah.
You might be thinking of Game Boy Advance. That came out around that time.
No, yeah, I guess so. Stood the test of time, though.
I was a Game Boy Advance boy though too. Wait, Advance is the one with that was like horizontally long? No.
Yeah, the original model was. Though they came out with the Game Boy Advance SP later, that was sort of like a flip screen model.
Now I'm already forgetting the Game Boy family. So yeah, I remember having like a horizontal purple one. That's it.
Yeah, that was the Game Boy Advance, all right.
Yeah, I
Yep.
posted it.
Yep. And then after that, it was the SP that I ended up getting for Kingdom Hearts.
And this is where all of you became obsessed with Pokemon, and where I completely missed it.
Do you mind if I go off on a bit of a tangent here, because I actually have kind of a story related to that?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I think I was around, like, I want to say 8 or 9 around this point. I had first played Kingdom Hearts like a couple of years ago, and I got Chain of Memories for the GBA as well. And the funny thing, like, shortly after getting the GBA, obviously they came out with the Game Boy Advance SP, and like Quick, I also got that later. And one day, like around this time period, I was taking a road trip with one of my cousins, and she really liked the first Kingdom Hearts, but she didn't have a GBA, she didn't have Chain of Memories, and it's like, okay, since I have this older Game Boy Advance model that I'm not really using anymore, it might be a good idea to just sort of gift it to her, and yeah, that's basically the end of that story. I sort of, I guess, helped one of my cousins get more into gaming with that. So there you go.
Spreading the good word with Kingdom Hearts. I don't know if I agree. I don't know. I feel like that could have gone either way. It could have been like, you could have made a gamer for life, or you may have put them off for life. But it sounds like it was the former.
Well, I didn't want to keep it on me too much, but just to piggyback off of that, I assume that part of lots of your gaming experiences had to do with RPGs, and I'm wondering if that played an effect on any of you guys getting into gaming.
I have a little bit to say about RPGs, but I'll get into it later. Like when I start talking about my story. Other than that, not really too much from me. Cora, how about you?
No RPGs in the first years of my gaming tenure.
Same for me as well. Actually, I was like shooter obsessed, and like, well, to be honest, for a very long part of my gaming career, quote unquote, whatever you want to call it, it's been shooters. But like, no, RPGs didn't really tend to become a thing until maybe like PS3 era. Funnily enough, didn't really tend to get into them before that point. So yeah, false assumption made there, Oecus.
I was just assuming.
Well, one thing I can correctly consume is that it's time to hear from everyone's joint favourite Maryland resident, Cora, on what his gaming journey is and how it started. Cora, why don't you take the floor?
Yeah, sure. So to be a little reductive, just to start out, when I became really, really obsessed with gaming was around COD, World at War, Modern Warfare 2, and I put a lot of hours in, but we need to go back a little bit before that for my first toe dips into gaming. I'm gonna skip, the Lego Racers and some of those other games that came out in the late '90s, early 2000s because I didn't own them. My parents weren't big on video games. They didn't really like them, and so it was 2003. So I was about 8 when I first got anything of my own, and it came in 2 phases. So for Christmas, I believe, or I think it was my birthday, 2003. I got the PS2, the big blocky one, and I got mostly sports games. I got all the 2003 editions of like Madden, um, the college football, NCAA 2003. I got NASCAR
I
Thunder
was
as
gonna say
well, which I
NASCAR,
think,
yeah.
yeah, if Sly was on, I would talk a little bit more about. But on the PS2 side, I don't think I'll get a lot of bites from you guys because so shooters were a no-go for a very long time for me. My dad was in the military. He was like, I don't like video games with violence in it because I think it takes away from the gravity of the situation. So the only shooter I ever had up until high school was Battlefront 2 because I said, "Well, I'm just shooting robots." And he went, whatever. I get Star Wars. He's like, I know what Star Wars is. You're doing Star Wars stuff. So that was like my only loophole. I think that was like, was that 2004 or 2005 Battlefront 2?
I want to say 4. I think.
I can
4
check
sounds
real
right.
quick. Hang on a sec.
Um,
'Cause
I got the remake.
Because I think it came out like around about the same time Revenge of the Sith did.
It came out Halloween of 2005.
Oh, bollocks.
So when I was 10.
Yeah, I just found the Wikipedia page. It says 2005.
Yeah. So that was my first shooter because for those reasons. So it was mostly sports games, but then on the other end of it, I went on a vacation to my grandpa's house the summer of 2003, and my cousin, he was like a year or two older than me. He had a Game Boy Advance with Pokemon Fire Red on it, and that one was a lot easier of a sell to my parents because we did a lot of road trips and a lot of camping. And I was like, hey, here's this device that runs on batteries. It'll distract us during the car rides, you know, because, it could be like 4, 5, 6 hours sometimes on the road. And, my brother and I were very prevalent, are we there yet? Because, staring outside at the scenery can only get you so far when you're 8 years old. So I got 3 games off the bat, but I only really played one with any level of consistency, which was I got Fire Red of my own. But I also got A Link to the Past and Four Swords, as well as this like retail Dungeons and Dragons Eye of the Beholder, which I just could not figure out at all. And actually, I was reading the reviews before we kind of called in, and it was like, hey, most people gave this a negative review because it was a PC port that had terrible UI and really poor pacing. And I was like, no wonder I couldn't get more than 30 minutes into it.
Yeah, I've got a story like that of a game I literally couldn't get past the first level for later on. Yeah, I've got one of my own for those. I think, to be fair, a lot of people, due to how much shovelware there was back in those days, I think everyone's got a story like that. I don't know if you guys have one, Max and Quick.
Max, you can go first.
I do have a quick story about it. I don't have too much of a personal memory of it, but I actually heard about this later. Okay, so I mean, the story ties back into my own origins a bit, but I'm only gonna give the origins that's actually relevant. So the first console I actually had was an N64, and one of the games that my dad got for it, all right, he didn't even remember which one it was, but he told me that it had Superman in it and he was flying through rings, and I think you all know which game he ended up getting that he didn't end up liking. Like, just based on that description.
Yeah, I think I have an idea.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's sort of like a second-hand shovelware experience for me.
Yeah.
So for me, shovelware, it's technically not shovelware, but it's the only game that I have a fond memory of being the only game that ended up getting thrown away, like physically, and that was for the PS2, I think. And my uncle took us to a used game shop, and I was looking at the games, and then I saw a Lego Bionic game, and me loving Legos at the time, I was like, oh, let me get this game. And I really love Bionicles too. So we finally get back to this place. I start playing the game, and I want to say within 4 hours, I beat the whole game, including like finding all the collectibles and stuff. And I was just pissed. So I ended up, telling my uncle that I want a refund for the game because it was horrible. I beat it way too quick. Um, and then, no pun intended. Um, so we were walking back to the store, and I kept on telling him that I want a refund, and then he finally just said throw it away. So I just threw it away, and then that was the end of that.
Well, so sorry, when you say throw it away, what, like you just threw it in a random bush or something?
No, like this is the New York streets, garbage cans.
Oh, okay, gotcha. No, I was just picturing you just like walking down the road, just going like, I'm fucking done with this shit. They're just tossing it into someone's like garden, and then, like the legacy of that game continues on with like the child who lived at that house.
That would be like a bit in like a late 2000s, early 2010s game review.
Yeah, yeah. You just go read it on some site and be like, my gaming journey began with like the most curious thing. One day, my dad went out and found a copy of Lego Bionicle on the garden floor. No one knew how it ended up there, but it changed my life. At least that's how I like to believe that story ended.
No, we're not litterers here, okay?
All right. It's just I don't know.
Wait a minute, can you really call yourself a New Yorker if you don't litter?
He's got a point.
I mean, those places are dirty. No offense to New Yorkers.
Oh, there was one other GBA game that I had, and that was Shrek Kart 2002.
What did you do in that, Cora?
I didn't realize that I was running a bootleg Mario Kart. I don't even know what Mario Kart was because you don't have a lot of market awareness. So I was like, yeah, I'm playing some Shrek Kart, and no one had Shrek Kart that I knew in any school.
I love that obsession back in the day, and I feel like it only ended in like I don't know, maybe early 2010s, where every franchise and its mother needed a kart game. Even stuff like that you would just just random like Disney properties that like should like you would never expect it to, and just like any random IP just seemed to get a kart game out of nowhere. It was very clearly an easy thing for developers to make.
And I mean, that's still kind of a thing nowadays. I mean, you got that, Crash Team Racing remake, or not Team Racing. It was actually I think it was Team Racing.
Nitro
You
Racing,
got
wasn't it?
Chocobo GP. You got the Sonic racing games that are still around. Nickelodeon Kart Racers. That's still a thing. I think with Mario Kart 8 Deluxe doing as well as it did, that's caused about just as many Mario Kart clones to pop up now as there always have been.
I think for me it's more so back in the day it was the randomness of the IPs that you would get. Like I'm struggling to think of any off the top of my head. I've definitely seen YouTube videos on the subject, but there are just like Eminem Racer, that's the one I was trying to remember. Like a kart racer of like the fucking chocolate, right? It's just why? Why does this need to happen? It's just so random. But I guess it must have made some kind of money. I guess. I don't know.
I mean, when you don't put much money into it, anything can make money.
I guess not. No, maybe they paid their workers in M&Ms.
You just reminded me of a big thing, Max, and that actually helped my gaming, and that was Crash Team Racing, and I completely forgot about that. And the
Oh,
reason
wow.
I say that is because when I was younger, part of my gaming experience was actually watching my brother complete some of the harder games. And at the time, Crash Team Racing was actually one of them. I remember him struggling to, 100% the game. Because back then, that's what we liked doing, like trying our best to 100% games.
Mm.
Yeah, I can imagine that was a bitch. I know. Crash games in general, like kart games, regular games, whatever, they do have a reputation for being really difficult to 100%.
So I just have a couple more titles that I want to go through while it's still in my slot.
Yeah, go for it.
Did anyone have for the PS2 the Namco Museum 50th anniversary game, or just the Namco Museum? that had like
I know what
Pac-Man.
Namco Museum is, but I don't think I ever owned any of them.
Yeah, it had Pac-Man, Dig Dug, Galaga, which was the one that I usually played the most. But it was like a bunch of retro games on the PS2.
Were you able to walk around the museum in that game?
I don't think so. Well, I don't remember a lot about the UI. I just remember more specifically about the games themselves.
Because I had one that sounds exactly what you're talking about, but to like actually access the games, you had to walk around the like Namco Museum and interact with the games.
I know that's a thing in Pac-Man World and like those games where like there's like a museum thing on the side where you walk around and access the games from, but I don't know whether or not that was a thing in like the Namco Museum series. I mean, it could have been for all I know. It's just that I know that it happens to be a thing in Pac-Man World as well.
Kind of reminds me of the Modern Warfare 2 museum at the end where you could just walk around, and then if you shot something, they would all like the mannequins and stuff would come alive and start shooting you. A bit more modern than what you're discussing, but it kind of sounds the same sort of like concept.
Museum things in games, I have to admit, are some of the most interesting things that I love. Like, for example, I'm pretty sure most of you guys play Ratchet and Clank. There's always that one secret level that lets you see behind the scenes of the developers, and I just think that
In the
seeing,
Insomniac Museum, I know about those. Yeah.
yes, seeing like I think that's an interesting insight into games, and it makes you, at least for me, love the game more because it's an extra added tidbit to see, the background of the game.
Yeah, that is one aspect I do miss of like older games where they loved their unlockables, even if it was stuff I never really chose to explore. They loved having like little Easter eggs and stuff you could like behind the scenes pieces, concept art, that sort of thing. Some games nowadays do still do that. Like Uncharted comes to mind. The more you get the treasures and stuff, you get character models, you get concept art, that sort of thing. But it used to be so commonplace back in the days, and it's a lovely little addition, even if it wasn't something you paid much attention to. All right then. Well, Cora, thank you for regaling us with your stories. It's time now to move on to participant number 3. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to hear about the bold origin story of one Maximum Max Cough. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so I guess the best place to start with this is, just the disclosure that, I am like a high-functioning autistic, and I was diagnosed with that at around 3 years old. So that would have been like 1998. Like, it could have been pretty early in that year, could have been pretty late in that year. I'm not sure when. But it was because of that that shortly after that diagnosis that my mom thought it would be a really good idea to help me work on my hand-eye coordination, and because that's one of the issues that a lot of autistic kids sort of struggle with early in life, and she figured that a video game system would actually be kind of perfect for that because like you use your hands to manipulate things on the screen that you have to pay attention to in order to get a win condition. So, that seems like the perfect thing to boost one's hand-eye coordination. And the funny thing is, around the time she was considering this, this would be in 1999 when she was considering this. Donkey Kong 64 had just come out, and it was bundled with a green Nintendo 64. So, I ended up getting that as a gift, specifically for like, physical/mental therapy purposes. And, that ended up sort of, that was sort of my introduction to gaming as a medium. And I mean, my parents did have like some older consoles before, like, they had an NES, they had an Atari, they had a Game Boy, but, the N64 was like their first, like, foray into modern systems because they completely skipped like the 4th gen systems and like the 5th gen systems until the N64. So, yeah, that was like, a pretty big jump for them as well as for me. But, I really enjoyed my time with the game, and oh, Quick's gone. But yeah, that was sort of my introduction to the medium. And, over time, like keep in mind, I was a little kid then, so naturally we had babysitters, and they also had an N64, and with that, I would find out about games like Mario, Smash Brothers, Banjo, some of the Pokemon games, that kind of stuff, and so I would use that to sort of get into those games as well, but my grandparents, they also had a PS1 at their house, so I was able to play a few games with that. But I think what really took me from seeing games as just sort of a toy or a side thing to, seeing them as something that's actually like, really impressive and really cool was around my 7th birthday. This would be in early 2002. My parents ended up getting a GameCube that was bundled with Super Smash Bros. Melee. Or actually, I don't know if it was bundled with it or if they just got it at the same time. It was a launch title. I mean, that could have happened. But I remember, now keep in mind, I was only 7 years old when this happened. So, like, people weren't really talking about the 6th-gen consoles, at least around me. I didn't even know they had existed. I didn't know the PS2 or the Xbox or the GameCube were a thing until, I got a GameCube for my 7th birthday. And I just remember, like, popping in Super Smash Bros. Melee, having a bit of experience with Smash Bros. From, like, one of my babysitter's houses, the N64 version. And, just, the jump from, being used to N64 graphics, to GameCube graphics, with no, like, PS2, Dreamcast, Xbox, or anything in between, like, it just completely blew my mind. Like, having that cinematic intro in the beginning that was like on par with like animated movies at the time, and being able to zoom in on the character models and see like the denim on Mario's jeans, or like being able to see the details in their irises and stuff like that, and having so many more characters and stages to run through. Well, and the score that was also like that was also like cinema quality and stuff like that, and also being really good and great to listen to, like that I think was the moment where I really like got into gaming as like a more passionate thing as opposed to more of like a sideline thing. And Kingdom Hearts came out later that year, so that was also like something that fueled that. And yeah, that's all I really have to say on that front. Yeah, you could say that those were what got me into gaming.
So that's actually quite interesting, because I think for many people the story is just, it would be, my friends are all playing games, so I got into it. I convinced my mum to buy a console or something like that. But you coming into it having that more like sort of practical application of helping you with your autism that's actually super interesting, and it's actually quite nice to hear that sort of thing, really, isn't it? Because it's like what is now like a hobby for you started off as something so much more, well, could be argued to be so much more important.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, because I mean, the intent was like largely practical at first, and then it became sort of a thing. And I mean, keep in mind, like fun was also a factor because I mean, they had like hand-eye coordination therapy at like the early childhood schools I was going to, but it was mostly just stuff like put a string through a hole in this wooden block. Yay, you did it. That kind of thing. Like that wasn't very engaging, but games had the novel idea of, hey, let's actually have more intricate tasks than this and also make them fun. So that was another factor in it, something that would actually make me want to improve my hand-eye coordination. And, I would say it worked. As I mentioned, I am a high-functioning autistic, which means I can actually, function in society like a human being for the most part. So that worked.
Yeah, no, that's it's pretty no, yeah, like I said, just interesting to hear that sort of thing. So you sort of I think based on my experience with you is you very much had like you've sort of gone for the Nintendo byline like throughout your gaming life. So do you I don't know where I'm going with this. Just sort of do you feel like you missed out on any of the other platforms or anything like that when you were in your childhood?
I mean, all right. So I did play a bit of NES and Atari and stuff like that because my parents had those systems too. But other than that, like I will say that I kind of wish I had the 4th gen systems earlier, like the SNES, the Mega Drive / Genesis. I kind of wish I had those earlier, but mainly because I wouldn't have had to seek them out when I got into retro gaming later. Because I remember like. I think it was in my preteens, early teens, when I discovered YouTube and discovered a lot of retro gaming and a lot of the cool stuff that you could play there. So and keep in mind, like, my dad's side of the family also had PlayStations at their place. Like I mentioned, my grandparents had a PS1. I ended up getting a PS2 later. And like I mentioned, Kingdom Hearts, that was another game that I played a lot on PS2 back then. So, I don't think I really missed out a whole lot on, like, the PlayStation side of things. Um, I never really got that much into Xbox, I will say that. And, but I wouldn't really say I missed out too much on it because there wasn't really a whole lot on that side that really interested me. Like, okay, uh, Cora mentioned that he wasn't that much into shooters. You, Para, mentioned that you were really into shooters. I've never really gotten that into them. Like, I've tried them a few times. They just didn't really sink their teeth into me. So, even though, like, yeah, that is, like, a big part of gaming that, I'm not that into. But at the same time, that is also, like, the main thing that Xbox sort of marketed itself for at the time, having this wide array of shooters that you could play online with people and stuff like that. And, that when I was a kid and preteen just didn't appeal to me as much as, the platformers, action games that were, available on the other systems.
Yeah,
Yeah, I would just.
Oh, sorry, yeah,
Go
go
ahead.
for it.
I was gonna say I would just like to clarify a little bit. With the shooters, it was more of like a imposed rule. And actually, I think because I wasn't allowed to play them when the gloves finally came off, I got really, really into them as a result. Because it was
I
like,
see, okay.
yeah, it was like you're not allowed to play these because violence, yada yada yada. And then when my dad finally went, like, all right, you're old enough, you can have the R-rated games, you can play Gears of War, you can play the CODs, you can get Halo 3. Then I'm like, oh, all right, now we're cooking. Now we got some high octane going on.
All right.
Yeah, I'm wondering if maybe because also on that Nintendo consoles, obviously there were just less shooters and stuff in general. It was like there was less exposure to sort of that side of things. I mean, I never had a GameCube myself, but from as I understand it, it was not that third party friendly as perhaps later on things like the Switch were.
Yeah, I mean, like, there were, like, I mean, there was Beautiful Joe and stuff like that, but I think even that came to the PS2 later. Um, yeah, but yeah, most of the stuff that, the GameCube was known for was first-party stuff, like, Melee, Wind Waker, Double Dash, those kind of games. Yeah, it was pretty much all first-party as far as what people were actually getting a GameCube for goes. Metroid Prime also, that's another one that was like a big selling point for the GameCube at the time.
Yeah, I remember playing that very briefly on the Wii and not remembering a great deal about it. I remember it being a lot harder than the third one. I'm hoping they do re-release it eventually in the future though, because I'd like to give it another go. So I think we've had quite a fairly interesting mix of you guys so far. Obviously, Max has been a bit more Nintendo focused. To Cora, it was a bit more on the PC, PS2 side, and then I think Quick for you, it was a bit of a mixture of everything. One thing I have noticed, however, and it's maybe just due to our ages in general, is there's not been much for the Xbox in general so far. Because obviously the Xbox did enter the scene fairly late compared to the other major publishers. I see Cora's unmuted himself.
Yeah, my only comment on the Microsoft systems was that once my PS2 kind of got old and I was looking to upgrade, I had way more friends on Xbox 360, and Xbox Live was kind of, I'm talking like 2008 to 2012, 2013 was kind of where it was at with the Halos and COD, Modern Warfare 2, and Gears of War. So I didn't touch um, an Xbox until the 360.
Yeah, I think to be fair, that is, at least in my experience, there was like this big resurgence in around about that time, 2008-ish, where everything went from being most people played on the PlayStation to most people played on the Xbox, because the PS3 didn't exactly have the most glorious launch, as is well documented by this point. But prior to that, when I think by that point, it's fair to say most of us here were teenagers by their early teens, maybe like very late childhood, but
By when exactly? Like around the start of the 7th generation?
Yeah. When the Wii, PS3, Xbox 360 came out.
Yeah, around that time I was like, 10 or 11, but I didn't really get a PS3 until I was like, I think 13 or 14. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I'd say like teens, preteens, we were around then, around the start of the 7th gen.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption.
For me, in terms of Xbox, I noticed that my friends and family members were mostly getting Xbox at the time, and it was mostly because of the shooters for things like Halo, Gears of War, etc. And I stuck with PlayStation just because I already had the PlayStation 1 and I already loved the franchises that were there. And then coming to the PS2 and PS3 at the time. But um, speaking about the PS3, I actually didn't get an Xbox even though it was cheaper at the time because I knew I wanted a PS3. So instead, I ended up getting a Wii. And, the Wii had the whole motion controls that, you could be active with people. And it goes back to me playing with my friends. So like we would go over each other's house and play, Wii Sports or Mario Kart, etc. And it was something that also grown-ups could play with us because for the most part, Nintendo games were simpler.
Yeah, I was gonna tack on to that by saying, didn't it seem like every like suburban family in the early seventh generation had a Wii, and someone had a parent that was like, "Oh, the bowling is my jam." Like there was always someone's parent at a house that I would go over as like a kid that like someone was like, "I'll play bowling with you guys. Like if you guys are gaming, I'll only do Wii Sports bowling." Maybe that's just like a very myopic view, but I got so many like bowling games again at like people's houses against random different parents.
No, yeah, I
Yeah, I mean, like
yeah.
my grandparents had a Wii with Wii Sports, so yeah, yeah, that's definitely the case.
I was only able to convince my nan to play games with me. I'm sorry for American viewers, that's my grandma to play with me one time, and that was Wii Sports Bowling. It's the only time she ever played video games. Yeah, so yeah, you're not alone on that one.
I'd like to go back to Xbox for a moment because all right, so Cora, like it sounds like you started with the Xbox 360, and I'm not sure if you really kept going with Xbox from there or not, but whether or not you did, I kind of have like almost the opposite story going on because in the sixth generation, I did also get an Xbox alongside a PS2 and GameCube because hey, new console, I 7-year-old me wants that because it's a new console, and now, the funny thing was, the game I ended up playing most for that ended up being like SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom because they're just the Xbox didn't really end up putting out much of anything else that really interested me that I couldn't also get on PS2 or GameCube. And so that's why when the seventh generation rolled around, I gravitated more towards a PS3 than a 360. Like pretty much everything I wanted on the 360 was also on the PS3. So and the PS3 also had, the kind of controller that I was more used to, and it also had like, Sony had other IPs like Ape Escape that I really liked. So that's why I sort of gravitated towards that when I was when the seventh generation rolled around.
Yeah, just to answer real quick, so we can get into Para. But I didn't really have any brand loyalty, and I did play Battle for Bikini Bottom, awesome game. But I followed what served my main interest at the time. So the switch to the 360 was predicated on multiplayer and friends and playing like that, and then I went back to the PS4 based on exclusives. So it was just, different eras of my life had different needs, and different consoles fit that better. And I would not hesitate to betray Sony again if, the Xbox Series X, whatever is the current one, suits those needs better in the future.
Makes sense, yeah.
Traitor. I think that's quite a natural thing, I think, for people as they grow older, especially, they start working, they start earning more money, they have more freedom to purchase more consoles, but people tend to branch out a lot more. I mean, I myself was big Sony simp for many years, but once we got like halfway through the PS4 generation, and as much as I loved the PS4 generation, because I there's a lot of my favorite games are there, I started feeling like there's no point. Like if you're being like a zealot for a particular brand, you are kind of doing yourself a disservice because there's so many amazing games out there. There's so many services and stuff you're keeping yourself away from, and the mentality is just not very healthy either. Well, I guess it depends on how you approach it, but if you enter yourself with this sort of mentality of sort of my tribe's better than better than yours, and like you convince yourself that you don't care about other games when they could actually be really good. So yeah, I think it is something people do tend to grow out of as they get a bit older. All right, so yeah, sorry, Max, do you want to say something?
Oh yeah, I mean, like, I agree with that because, like I said, like, as far as, like, the first party lineup goes, Sony has a lot more that appeals to me than Xbox does generally, but on the other hand, the way Sony's been going the past several years, with the change in management, change of direction, all that, like, completely dissolving Japan Studio, for example. Like, yeah, Sony does technically have those IPs still that I like, but at the same time, I'm not 100% certain they'll actually do too much with them in the future. So, yeah, if, I end up, like, going for, like, if I end up having to pick between a PS5 or an Xbox Series, whatever the newest one is, I might just go with Xbox depending on what they're offering. And that would be my first Xbox since the very original. So, yeah, that's just sort of an example of what Cora's been talking about.
I love how the common uniting factor is no one knows the name of the current Xbox because their naming conventions have not been very memorable. All right, anyway, so thank you, Max, for your introduction to your gaming life. So time to move on to the fourth and final, last but not least, some may say the best of them all. That's me. So yeah, so for me, my story's not too dissimilar to some of the ones you guys have discussed a bit earlier. When I want to say 6, 7, around about that time, my family got their first ever personal computer. It was one of those very old, like blue and grey ones with a floppy disk drive and the disk drive, and it took forever to do anything. This was before dial-up internet. We were at a very primitive point of time back then, but this was my first gaming platform, quote unquote, and it wasn't really me who got into it, because at the time I didn't really know of video games as a concept in general, to be honest with you. It wasn't really something that registered to me. I was very big into my toys at the time, as my Action Man and my, my dominoes and stuff like that, stupid shit. But when we got this console, this PC, my dad, who had purchased it, got a bunch of like games from like friends of his. They all came in this little box, which we still have up in our loft nowadays, and all their little individual sleeves. It was mostly sports and racing games, kind of similar to what Cora had. So I'll never forget some of those titles. Redline Racer, one of the worst biking games I've ever seen in my life. Ultimate Race Pro, like the most cliched racing game you ever see. You'll have like Football Manager games, which we were obsessed with, me and my brother. But the one that always stands out to most of all, and probably the game I credit myself as the first, like, quote unquote real game that I played, was a strategy game called Total Annihilation. Now, this is a bit of a cult classic game, even to this day, despite the fact it's over 20 years old, is still getting mod support from its community. It's basically a top-down strategy game where you have two sides, very similar to something like Age of Empires, but it's quite unique in terms of how the economy and everything works, and you fight each other. And I couldn't get into it at the time, but as time sort of went on, I appreciated it a bit more, and I realised that this was really my first actual game. And for me, it was that early PC gaming period where my dad would just occasionally come back home with like, oh, my mate Derek's is giving me this game here. We should give it a go. And then it'll be ended up a game that I'm still playing today, because it ended up being, by pure coincidence, something that's really popular in Russia and is still being supported, and is still available on like GOG or something. And so yeah, for me, it was PC gaming that started me into it.
Yeah, I have two things I want to say to that. So there were some absolutely ludicrous racing games on the market back in the day where everyone was trying to like figure out their niche, and you had some like really weird arcade sim trying to find like which one was better, and like companies were trying to pass off games as sims that like definitely were not sims because the physics engines could not actually support anything close to a simulated driving experience. And so it was a real crapshoot outside of like, that's why I gravitated so closely to the NASCAR games, because they were consistent back when EA was a company that cared about their sports games. So we're talking like closer to the beginning of the golden age. And I think those kinds of games that caught my attention early on were the ones that shaped my fandom of sports actually in the future. And then the other thing that I wanted to say was that I really wish I knew about RTSs and other strategy games much earlier in my life because I got Civ 4 in a box because some guy didn't want it anymore, and I played that for thousands of hours on the PC.
Yeah, I wish I'd played Civ 4 a bit earlier, or any of the Civ games a bit earlier in my life. Like, I played 5. I want to say I first started playing, like, about 2015 or something, and just became obsessed with the franchise in general. I know as a kid I would have played the shit out of that. I would have absolutely loved it. I mean, I love it as an adult, but I know I would have played it a lot more as a kid. Yeah. But, yeah, RTSs are a big part of that childhood. But the PC gaming came and went, but where it really began is where it became sort of like, this is just something I do when I come home, was to become an absolute obsession. One day, I didn't know this was happening. My brother came back home with a PS2, and he had a demo disc, and I just sat, because we used to sleep in the same room back then, so I was sat there in there watching him play his games, and he played his demo disc, and he was playing Final Fantasy X. He was playing FIFA 03 or whatever it was at the time. He was playing all these different games. The one that always stands out to me is Airblade. I don't know if anyone knows what Airblade is. It's basically like a skateboarding game, but it's like a hoverboard thing. It was terrible, but that was my first experience with the PS2, was playing Airblade, and not being able to complete the level, despite getting very close. But basically, being the jealous little shit that I was like, Mummy, I want a games console as well. And like, Mum wasn't going to buy 2 PS2s. And my brother was very guarded, and like, because I'd broken some of his Lego like the year before, he didn't want me touching any of his stuff. So I couldn't play on the PS2. My mom wasn't going to buy a second PS2, so she got me a PS1.
Yeah, as an older brother, I completely understand. Even if it wasn't justified, I understand the rationale.
Yeah, it's, I think, looking back on it, I'm like, yeah, I get it, but yeah, my brother would just not let me touch any of his stuff. Like, I remember spending, like, hours at a time outside our room, just staring through a tiny crack in the window, just to see what he was playing, because he wouldn't let me in the room with him.
I think it was the opposite for my brother and I, because we basically had one console that we would always share, and we never had like a lot of times where, okay, you play for 30 minutes, then I can play for 30. It's just, we've just known when to give the other person a chance to play. The only times that we got our own consoles were for the handhelds, because it makes sense to have your own handheld. And we would usually have one get the other one like right around the same time, so there was no jealousy for having one.
That's quite lucky, actually.
I mean, the system my dad and I used when we played like DK64 together, or like Donkey Kong 64 together, like when I was younger, was okay. Whenever one of us dies, we switch off, and whenever one of us collects one of the golden bananas, we also switch off. Like, that was sort of the thing we had. So we each got like a decent chunk of play time, before before we switched, before we switched players. Like, I feel like that would work for DK64 specifically, but maybe not so much for other games, because I know if you did that for Mario 64, you'd be switching off like pretty much every minute.
Yeah, the death system was something that I had with my little brother with some of those games. And also to kind of avoid any fights, my mom would specifically, like when she was going to the store and looking for games for holidays, she would look on the back because she found that there was a little split screen icon that would
Yeah.
show if something was like multi. Yeah, were you gonna jump in on that?
No, I was just agreeing. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the split screen feature was like a prerequisite for almost all the games that we would get. Like she would buy 3 games, one for me, one for him, and one for both of us. And also, so you bring up Airblade. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna like know what that was, but it did remind me of SSX Tricky, which I did play, which was a snowboarding game.
I imagine it was fairly similar. I'm guessing you just like doing tricks and stuff. I mean, obviously with snowboarding, it's more like. Well, actually, no, I was going to say it's more like downslope, isn't it? But there's snowboarding like half pipe and stuff, isn't there?
Yeah, I believe it was a mix of like races and then points earning, like you would be in like a little area, and you would be doing, grinds and flips, and the point was to, rack up a high score. I think it was segmented into like those two game modes and like maybe a time trial. I'm thinking of the right game.
Yeah, that sounds right for the sort of thing I was expecting. No, but so yeah, for me it was when my mum caved in and bought me my PS1. Was when that to me was when it really began. As much as I love my PC gaming like origins and like when I, when a lot of those games I'm still playing today just because they're so brilliant and like you can still get access to them. For me, it was the PS1 where it really started, and this is where it gets a little bit cliche. It was games like the Spyro trilogy, which obviously a lot of people I know in this chat love, Crash Bandicoot, Spider-Man, things like that. And then you've got your raft of terrible licensed games. So it is time for me to get to the game I mentioned earlier. There was a game. So obviously I was very into football as a child, and for our viewers, European football. I'm not going to call it soccer. Fuck you. There was this game. It was called The Mission. And it was basically like, I've never heard anyone else mention The Mission before in my life. But basically what it was, the idea of it was, they took the 11 licensed players who were very popular at the time in football. And basically it was this secret agent thing where like they were all recruited to a secret agency and they all went off to they all went off to like do this mission or something, but basically I couldn't get past the very first level. All you had to do, I swear to God, all you had to do was like score a goal or something, or just like kick a ball into a net or take out a security camera. Something. It was basically kick a ball at something, and I could not do it for the life of me. My parents spent like 10 quid on this game for me because I was like, "Mommy, this game looks amazing. It's got Edgar Davids in it, mommy." But it ended. I just couldn't even do the first fucking level, and I remember the controls just being absolute dog doo doo. It was terrible, but there was a lot of that back then. It was just like I was very easily drawn in by particular certain games. And if it was a football game or like something like that, I would so easily be drawn in. And there's a lot of trash still on my shelves nowadays from those days.
Just as a quick question about sports games, did you have a favorite football team before you got sports games, or did playing those games kind of influence some of your fandom?
So I mean, when I was younger, I don't even want to call myself a glory seeker. I don't know if you know what a glory seeker is. It's basically someone who basically supports whoever's winning at the time.
Like a bandwagoner.
Yeah, like a bandwagoner. But I jumped loyalties fairly frequently, and my loyalties would be based on the most inane shit. Like, I remember one time I supported Leeds United because there was a guy on the team called Lee Bowyer, and he had Bow in his name, and I was really into bows as a kid. It was really stupid like that. But I did eventually settle on Manchester City. This was a very long time before they became an extremely rich and successful club. They were very awful back then, but it was Manchester City as a youth, and that was my sort of thing. And it wasn't really influenced by the video games at all, but because of the way those video games work, is I would tend to play as a slightly richer club, so I could actually do some more like transfers and stuff in career mode and things like that. But no, it didn't end up like affecting my loyalties at all. No.
Yeah, when I played specifically racing games, I gravitated to cars that had the coolest paint schemes, and then I just started rooting for them when they came on TV.
Yeah, it's always some shit like that.
Yeah, I do have one follow-up question. This one's applicable to everyone because I think everyone said they played both the PS1 and the PS2. How much of a game changer was it when the dual analogs came on?
So
The
I'm
left and
gonna
right
get mine
stick.
out of the way straight away. I never played anything other than dual analog. By the time I got to the PS1, the PS2 was already out. So I had like the slim PS1, the actual PS1, not the PSX, and it came with dual analog sticks. I never played anything else, so I can't comment on that one.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, like the PS1 my grandparents had also had like the dual analog controllers. So like, I never really known what it's like to play a PS1 game without those. In fact, but I do know that like it's sometimes a little weird for me. Like when I play a PS1 game that doesn't support the dual analog sticks, like I usually spend a few seconds going like, wait a minute, why don't these work? And then it's like, oh, okay, it only uses the D-pad. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
So for me, and I'm pretty sure this was the first game that used it. It was Ape Escape. So
Yep.
I remember playing Ape.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I remember playing Ape Escape and just like it had inverted controls or something like the inverted up and down. I forgot what it's called, and just using that was very confusing to me at the time.
So the way I heard it was that there were other games that like allowed you to use the DualShock as like an optional thing, but Ape Escape was the only one or the first one that mandated using DualShock. Like you could not play it with like the originally released controller because the control scheme was like sort of tied to the two analog sticks.
I gotta say, it's what Quick mentioned about the inverted controls. It's one of those things you don't really think about nowadays. But going back and playing old games, it's always one of those things where you go, "Oh my god, yeah, this was a thing, wasn't it?" And it's always like the first thing you turn off. I think I did meet someone who actually used them once, but I swear to God, like 99% of people I know never used them. They hated it. It was silly. I don't know if any of you guys are cursed and actually did use them.
The only times I do use them are in games where you can't turn them off. Like there are parts, you know, like I mentioned like several months to you, like when I played through the Spyro trilogy again. There are parts like you know when you're in Hunter's Plane or whatever, where you know you have to shoot targets, and like it suddenly throws you into these inverted up and down controls where you're like, oh god, I'm trying to shoot up, but when I go up, I go down. What's going on?
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Ace Combat did inverted controls because of the yoke. You know, you would pull you pull forward, like you pull down to go up. You know, because that's how it would work in like the cockpit, and that took a little bit. I think like Ace Combat 4. If anyone played that game.
I mean, I kind of get it if you're like, you know, specifically aiming to emulate the control style of a plane, you know, but one, you know, make it optional, and two, give me a bit of warning when you're about to do that.
Uh, I I'm not sure if it was Ace Combat, but I did have a piloting game. Like I even had the flight joystick or whatever it's called. But I didn't end up using that because I have no memory of using that joystick. But I do remember playing flying games where it was inverted and it made a little more sense when you're flying for some reason.
And then also to answer my own question about the analog sticks, since I played PS2 first, I went over to a friend's house who had a PS1 controller, and I went, "Where are the analog sticks?" It's like, "What are you talking about? This is a PS1. They don't have them."
Was it one of those
And
really
I just,
battered third-party controllers?
yeah. Then I got absolutely dumpstered in whatever game we were playing, and I was so mad.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds very familiar. I think we've all mentioned about like obviously the local multiplayer thing on the old console side. I think we probably all have some memories of either being done dirty by being given a third party controller, or very specifically giving a crappy third party controller to our second player.
No comment.
Yeah. At least for me, I actually had a third party controller that was mine. Like I chose it for myself because I liked the translucent controllers. And at the time, I can't remember if it was PS2 or PS1. They didn't have a translucent one. So when I went to the game store and I saw that, I was like, I need it. I want it.
There was this obsession, wasn't there, back in like the turn of the century, of having translucent peripherals and consoles, and it would always be like bright colors as well. It would be like purple, orange, green, blue. I remember seeing it in like the catalogs and stuff at the time. They were just obsessed with those translucent colors. I kind of miss them though. They're tacky, but I kind of miss them.
Same.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth.
Yeah. What we have lost along the way, huh? So, one last thing I wanted to mention before we sort of get to the end of my story at the beginning is the game that I knew converted me from I don't even know what you want to call it, a hobbyist to an actual game itself. And that is Metal Gear Solid. That was the first game I ever experienced that had like a proper story. It was serious, it had stakes, it was emotional. I remember playing that as a kid and being blown, like the Psycho Mantis sequence, so many parts of the game that just blew my mind as a little young gamer. And I have memories so vivid of all the different things that happened in that game. And to this day, it is still my favourite game of all time. And it's not nostalgia, Because I go back and every single time I play the game, I remember how beautifully tight it is in terms of how the story is done. Because I think so many of the older Metal Gear Solid games were so overindulgent, whereas Metal Gear Solid 1 story is so much more slimmed down. But for me, that was the starting point. That was when I was just like, this is an art form. This is games can be so much more than just fun. They can be something genuinely beautiful, something that can make me cry, there's something that can make me happy, whatever, something that can make me root for these random digital characters. It was the turning point for me where I became a gamer, to put it simply. So I don't know if you guys have a very specific game you feel that same way about that sort of changed things for you.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief, but it was the 501st Journal in Star Wars Battlefront 2, if you guys are familiar with.
I am, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that one was especially when the heel turn happened, when you went from fighting on Geonosis against droids to showing up on Coruscant and then you're like, wait, are we the baddies? That was kind of my first story twist in a game where I went, oh.
Yeah, I remember because like there's the cutscene at the end, because you have the level on Felucia, I think it's called, where you fight against the droids, but and then at the end of it, like you see them lining up basically to kill Ayla Secura, and like you like the narration I remember being brilliant. It's just that she was just like, she said we were the bravest men we ever fought with. We couldn't bear to look her in the eye. I remember that very clearly.
Because then right after that you go to like Kashyyyk, and then you're fighting Wookiees, and you're like, wait a minute, I like Wookiees.
Yeah, no, that's a lot to memories. That was the original Battlefront 2 was great. I can't believe I have to say the original Battlefront 2 because EA are not, well, most companies these days are not very imaginative with their names, but yeah, that was a great little game.
I'm gonna skip answering this question for the time being because I honestly feel like games that have like really impressionable stories, that sort of change your own perspective on games in general, or like otherwise just leave a really big impression on you. I kind of feel like that could be its own topic for a whole other TPOG episode, but so yeah, I'll just go ahead and skip this one for now.
You know what? That is completely fair. Yeah.
Well, for me, to keep it brief too, there are games that got me into other games, like Modern Warfare 2 got me into shooters, but the one game that I would say, well, I always consider myself a gamer, but the one that actually pushed me forward is surprisingly PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. And the
Nice.
reason for that is that I was, very active in the forums. I take pride in this, so I had one of the most successful move sets, and I probably helped start the whole moveset craze. So yes, I'm taking, pride for that. But being on that forums and then seeing how people were all suggesting all these different games and characters that I never heard of made me end up searching more games, looking at more uh, different genres and stuff. And it's also ironically, well, not ironically, uh, where I ended up finding Persona, and the people know here how much I love that series was because of PlayStation All Stars and just reading about different games. And it just introduced some of the game series that I really love today, like Persona, like I said, Disgaea, and more.
No, yeah, I had a fairly similar experience with PlayStation All Stars. So for our viewers or listeners, we were born out of PlayStation All Stars. Essentially, we first started off as a group for it, and that's kind of where where it all began. So for us as a whole, PlayStation All Stars does hold a very special place in our heart. But like Quick, for me, I had a similar experience where it wasn't even necessarily games that were represented as part of PlayStation All Stars. Doesn't mean that games that they didn't have to be represented in the game with like a map or a character or anything, but there were so many suggestions on the forums for what games should be added and what should be represented, and that caused me to branch out. So for some examples I can think of Valkyria Chronicles, for example, that is genuinely one of my favorite games of all time, and I found out about that through the PlayStation All Stars forums. Things like Starhawk, Twisted Metal, things like that, stuff like I'd maybe heard of, but at the time hadn't really experienced, and went on to have some incredible experiences. So as much as looking back on it, I wasn't a big fan of my like Sony tribalism back then, it did lead towards some really good gaming experiences. That did, and I'm very grateful for that. All right, so I think we've just about got through everyone. We've regaled each other with some fairly interesting stories about how it all began. I think we've got a couple of other ideas for some future episodes, as Max mentioned. I think it would be a good idea to do an episode purely on, sort of games that changed us or that sort of thing. And I think maybe an episode about PlayStation All Stars forums and about PlayStation All Stars in general is perhaps in order a bit later down the line to sort of shed some light on what it was like back then, since there's actually very few of us left from back in those days still in TPOG. But I'm going to open the floor for any last few remarks before we bring it to a close. Does anyone have anything they want to say before we finish up?
Yeah, I'll just say that in general, when you said forums, early forums in general were crazy, and I think that there's a lot of like stuff that could be said. Like there's a whole untapped like quadrant of my gaming pie that went to like online PC games that had like active forum communities on it and interacting with all those people and coming up with strategies.
I miss those old school forums. I think for the most part they've sort of been replaced by Reddit nowadays, haven't they? That's sort of like taken over from old school forums. But I miss them. There was some good memories on those.
Yeah, Reddit
Yeah, more or
subreddits
less.
with Discords. It's kind of the new meta when it comes to sharing gaming information.
Sorry, Max, did you want to say something?
No, I didn't really have anything else to say. No.
Okay. Cool. Quick, anything from you?
Thing I was gonna say is, like I was saying earlier, it's something with layers, and like Max said, we can make other topics. And one of the things I was gonna bring up, but it could be another topic, was League of Legends was another layer for me that pushed me more into looking at esports of games, and it's probably the one game that I've been playing the longest.
Yeah, I think that's definitely esports could definitely be a whole other topic. I think there's definitely a few conversations to be had here about that. All right then, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to leave it at that for tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in, listening, viewing, whatever you might be doing on whatever platform you might be enjoying this on. I have been Parasoft, and I've been joined here today by my good friends Cora, Max, and Oecus. We will come to you with another episode sometime in the future. We're not on a strict schedule at the moment, but obviously we will let you know when the time comes. But any closing remarks for anyone? Does anyone want to say goodbye before we wrap things up?
Bye bye.
Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next time. Farewell.